Equatorial Guinean Literature in Spanish. Equatorial Guinea was the only Spanish colony in sub-Saharan Africa. During its colonial history between 1778 and 1968, it developed a tradition of literature in Spanish, unique among the countries in Africa, that persists until the present day. The literature of Equatorial Guinea in Spanish is relatively unknown, unlike African literature in English, French, and Portuguese. For example, Birmingham, a professor at Morgan State University, searched 30 anthologies of literature in Spanish published between 1979 and 1991 and did not find a single reference to Equatorial Guinean writers. The same thing occurs in anthologies of African literature in European languages published in the 1980s and in specialized journals such as Research in African Literatures, African Literature Today, Presence Africaine or Canadian Journal of African Studies. This began to change in the late 1990s with the publication of a monograph in the journal Afro-Hispanic Review, and with the conferences Spain in Africa and Latin America, the other face of literary Hispanism at the University of Missouri in Columbia, Missouri, in May 1999 and Primer Encuentro de Escritores Africanos en Lengua Española First Encounter with African Writers in the Spanish Language in Murcia, Spain in November 2000. Predecessors. The first references to Africa in literature began in the 15th century with Portuguese and Spanish exploration of the Atlantic. This period was one of exploration and conquest, and the literature written then contains travel accounts, memoirs, chronicles, and reports. The next period, one of occupation and exploitation, is characterized by colonial literature. The central theme of this literature is a savage, wild Africa. The protagonists are idealized white characters with a negative, paternalistic vision of the Africans, who are portrayed as inferior beings. These novels were written for the audience of the colonialists, not a local audience, and were used as justification for colonialism. Beginnings. The beginnings of Equatorial Guinean literature in Spanish are connected with La Guinea Española Spanish Guinea, the missionary journal of the Seminary of the Sons of the Immaculate Heart of Mary on the island of Bioko. This journal, which was founded in 1903, was profoundly colonialistic and directed to a white audience. It did not include contributions from Guinean writers. However, in 1947 a new section was added in which writers recorded local stories and myths to preserve and disseminate them. Their ultimate purpose was to become better acquainted with the Equatorial Guinean peoples in order to be better able to civilize them. This gave the African Guinean students of the seminary an opportunity to become writers for the journal. At first, they merely transcribed the local oral tradition of the griot or jelly, but gradually, their writing became a bridge between African oral tradition and European written tradition. Among these writers are Esteban Boileau, André Zakuka Ebamabom, and Constantino Oshaya Mve Bengozama. They maintained a strong ethnographic component in their writing, but they also set the stage for a new native literature. The first Equatorial Guinean novel was Cuando los Combs le Chaban Novela de Costumbres de la Guinea Española When the Combs Fought. A novel of the customs of Spanish Guinea, by Leoncio Avida Inoue Udubiandiola, Bata, Equatorial Guinea, 1929, edited in 1953. The novel takes place in Rio Muni, among the Com or Mdowe ethnic group that of the author, in a pre-colonial era. It is written from the point of view of the protagonist, a white Protestant missionary. On occasion, he is used by the author to contrast European civilization with the savagery of African customs, which are explained in detail. This rejection by the author of his own identity, classified under the so-called literature of consent, was widely used by the Spanish colonial authorities as an example of the civilizing effect of African colonization. Music of Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea's culture has been more documented than most African countries, and commercial recording remains scarce. This is partially due to the country's small size and a population of only about 676,000. Equatorial Guinea was carved out of three former Spanish colonies, Rio Muni, a strip of land between Cameroon and Gabon, Bioko, an island near Cameroon, and Annobon, an island in the Atlantic Ocean far from the mainland. The national anthem of Equatorial Guinea was written by Atanasio Ndongo Mion, and adopted in 1968, when the country gained independence from Spain. In 1962, the second Equatorial Guinean novel, Una lanza por el Boabi a Spear for the Bobi, by Daniel Jones Mathama San Carlos, 1913, was published. It is sometimes erroneously considered to be the first. The protagonist of this novel, Gu, is an African who tells the story of his life. The writing has an autobiographical character. For example, the character Bobi, Gu's father, is based on Maximiliano C. Jones, Daniel Jones Mathama's father, who is a local authority sympathetic to the colonial government. The plot follows Gu's childhood in Fernando Po, his move to Spain and his return to Guinea after his father's death. From the ethnographic point of view, the novel is very interesting, detailing the customs of the Bubi ethnicity of the island of Bioko. It may also be classified as part of the literature of consent, since Bobi is the perfect example of a savage who is civilized by contact with the colonizers. It is an inescapable duty to proclaim far and wide the great work that Spain is doing on that island. Between 1962 and 1968, the date of Equatorial Guinea's independence, no important works were published. However, some authors continued to edit stories, legends, and ethnographies in various journals: Marcello Assistention Dongomba, Constantino Asha, Angel Mma, Rafael Maria Nzi, and Francisco Bang. In contrast to other African literary traditions, no anti-colonial works or works about combat appeared, and poetry did not attain great importance. Also, the authors of the time period attempted to reach the audience of the colonial power, not the local audience. Independence and exile. These small shoots of a literary tradition were uprooted when, only months after being democratically elected, Francisco Macias Ngma installed a dictatorship, termed Afro-fascist by the historian Max Lineker Gumas. As a result of this regime of terror, a third of the Equatorial Guinean population had gone into exile in neighboring countries or in Spain by the mid-1970s. The writer Juan Balboa Bonique refers to this as the lost generation. Madrid and the other places where the diaspora settled were foreign and sometimes hostile lands, which is reflected in the literature. The works of this time period circulated on single sheets of paper or in notebooks, or in limited edition magazines and leaflets published by the refugees. Consequently, this literature did not reach the Guinean public or the Spanish public. These pieces were usually written in poetic form and carried a forceful message, as shown by the poem Vamos a matar al tirano, Let Us Kill the Tyrant by Francisco Zamora Labic, or sometimes a message of nostalgia for the writer's homeland, such as the poem Don Estas Guinea? Where Are You, Guinea? By Juan Balboa Bonique. Writers from the diaspora also wrote narratives of exile. For example, El Sueño, The Dream, and La Travesía, The Crossing by Donato Ndongo by Diogo Nifong, Rio Muni, 1950, La Última Carta del Padre Fulgencio Bod, CMF. The Last Letter of Father Fulgencio Bod, CMF. By Matla Labic, 1912-1976, and B by Francisco Zamora Labic, Santa Isabel, 1947. These stories focus on the violent uprooting, both physical and spiritual, of the protagonist, connected with the history of the African continent before independence. Also, essays were written that focused on the political situation in Equatorial Guinea and the tragedy of its people. For example, Historia y Tragedia de Guinea, Equatorial History and Tragedy of Equatorial Guinea, 1977, by Donato Ndongo by Diogo and Don Estas Guinea? Where Are You, Guinea? 1978, by Juan Balboa Bonique. Raquel Ilo and B. Carrasco, 1938. Pen name for Raquel del Pozo Pita, whose mother was Guinean and whose father was Spanish, is a unique figure in this movement. Elan moved away from Guinea before she was a year old, grew up in Spain, and returned to Guinea after she was married to search for her roots. She wrote a collection of poems entitled Saiba Kapak between 1966 and 1978. Its theme is the search for identity, not personal suffering or the trauma of exile. After 1979, after Macias Ngma was overthrown by his nephew Teodoro Obiang, who is still president as of 2009, the culture of the country began to recover slowly. 1981 to 1984. Barrington divides the most recent time period into two stages. The first stage began in 1981 with the publication of the first children's book, Leyendas Guineanas Guinean Legends by Raquel Aland. Aland had to travel through the most remote areas of the country to compile the material for the 8 legends that make up her book. Also from this time period are Oborai by the Exile 1982, and Susurros y Pensamientos Comentados, Desde mi Vidriera Comments on Whispers and Thoughts, From My Window 1983, both by Juan Balboa Bonique. Both are volumes of poetry. In some poems, the author frequently mixes words in the Bubi language, the native language of his ethnic group, with Spanish, and other poems are written completely in Bubi. The books focus on the exile and suffering of the Bubi people, persecuted by Ngma's regime. At the end of this period, Antologia de la Literatura Guineana Anthology of Guinean Literature 1984, by Donato Ndongo by Diogo, was published. 1984 present. The second stage of the literary renaissance in Equatorial Guinea is related to the creation of the Center for Hispanic Guinean Culture in Malabo in 1982. The center contains a library and performs many cultural activities. It publishes its own quarterly magazine about cultural issues, Africa 2000, and has its own publishing house, Center for Hispanic Guinean Culture Publishing, dedicated to Guinean writers, both established figures and young talents. Some notable narrative works that it has published include El Amigo Fiel the Faithful Friend 1987, by Ana Lord Sohora, Afan, La Cabrita Reina Afan, The Little Goat Queen 1989. And La Ultima Lección del Venerable Imaga Ella The Last Lesson of the Venerable Imaga Ella 1991, by Anamoisono Ndongo, and Buchiba 1990, by Pedro Cristino Buriberi. Poetic works include Gritos de Libertad y de Esperanza Shouts of Liberty and Hope 1987, by Anacleto Olomai by Delirios Delirium 1991, by Maria Nsu Yang. The authors of the second stage are characterized by their use of themes that relate to their lives in one way or another, which are often reinterpreted to depict the reality of Equatorial Guinea in symbolic form. In 1985, Akoma by Maria Nsu Yang, the first novel written by an Equatorial Guinean woman, was published. The novel ends with his voluntary return to Spain. Voces de Espumas Voices from the Surf 1987, by Ciriaco Bocasa, was the first book of poetry written on Guinean land by an Equatorial Guinean writer. The poems recount the suffering and the silence of the author, as well as personal reflections on poetry. That same year, Juan Balboa Bonique published his first anthology of poetry, Sunos en mi Selva Dreams in My Forest. Balboa Bonique, through his representation of the suffering of Guinea, transcends the provincialism that had characterized the country's poetry before then. In 1987, Las Tinieblas de tu Memoria Negra The Darkness of Your Black Memory, a novel by Donato Ndongo by Diogo, was published. It also contains autobiographical themes, although the author considers it an autobiography of his generation. It depicts a child in Rio Muni during the end of the colonial era. The innocent vision of the child allows the author to depict his own sharp and ironic vision of the contradictions of the colonial regime. Authors: some recent authors, Anamoisono 1954–1996, Maria Nsu Yang 1945, Juan Balboa Bonique 1938. Juan Tomás Avila Laurel 1966, Donato Ndongo by Diogo 1950, Raquel Ilonb 1938-1992, Constantino Oshaya Mve Bengobzama, 19-1991, Mercedes Jora, Gerardo Bihori, Juan Manuel Jones Costa, A. Geronimo Bomaba, Joaquin Bomio, Justo Boliquia Bolica Maximiliano Nko Joe. Leoncio Avida Inouye 1929–1996,